All right, thank you very much, David. And I will be talking about sound splits on the reciprocating cellar, and that's this picture that we have here in the background. Now, I'd also like to acknowledge my co-authors for this, Drs. Maria Belota from Virginia Tech and Jeff Dunn from North Carolina State University. So some real quick background here for the grading system. The USDA introduced the grading system for peanut in the United States in the mid-50s, 1956 for runners and 1959 for Virginia market types. And for the purposes of today's talk, the general idea here is that a sample is taken of the farm stock peanut at the buying point. It's run on a pre-sizer that then goes on to the reciprocating sheller, after which the kernels are sized on different screens. After this point, segregation is determined for the load, and for segregation 1 loads, various premiums and discounts are applied according to kernel content, damage, foreign material, and sound splits. And so a sound split is essentially an otherwise sound mature kernel for which the cotyledons have separated. And the deduction that corresponds to these sound splits is at the rate of 80 cents per ton per percent above 4% sound splits. So sound splits, where did you come from and where do you go? And there's 2 primary avenues by which we see an increase in sound splits. And the first is through a predisposition through an increased rate of creating sound splits through curing regimes that include high temperatures and or low relative humidity amounts. And that results in a rapid drying condition for the load. And this has been associated with reduced milling quality, marketable weight, and in some cases, a flavor, particularly when immature peanuts are cured as such. The other avenue that we see sound splits being created is through physical trauma by way of physically separating those cotyledons, namely through using the incorrect size grids. When too small of a size of the grid holes are used for too large of a kernel, it just doesn't fit that right. And so in those cases, those sound splits are not associated with milling quality, adverse effects, marketable weight, or decrease in flavor. And so when we're looking at food-based applications for which the peanuts are going to be crushed anyway, such as peanuts, there's absolutely nothing wrong with the sound split for those purposes, especially if it's created through that physical separation means. And when we look at US peanut production, more than 56% of US peanuts go towards peanut butter itself. As far as the price, sound splits themselves are sold for the same price as whole kernels, at least with respect to mediums and jumbos. And so just to kind of put this in perspective, we're going to look at a timeline here for runner market type cultivars that have been more or less the major players on the scene. And specifically, we're looking at runner market types here since they are infamous for having been characterized by single cultivar domination. And so we're just going to kind of run through this a little bit quick. 1943, Dixie Runner was released, and it was the first for this time frame that was the major cultivar for runners that was utilized. And it has a 100 kernel weight of about 42 grams. After that, earlier runner was released, 1952. That became the next major cultivar, 54 grams, a little bit larger there. Right after that, 1956, USDA AMS, it codified the runner grading system. And then at the end of the 60s, man goes to the moon and flow runner lands on the scene. And for the next 2 decades after that, it was the major market type for runners in the US, still sitting at about 50 grams per 100 kernels. At the end of the 1990s and even through the early 2000s, the next cultivar there, Georgia Green, still sitting right about that same seed size, right about 59 grams. And so not a whole lot of change overall so far. After that, in 2006, we've got 2 commonly named varieties there, Georgia Greener and Georgia 06G, each having seed weights of 63 grams and 70 grams. So it's starting to see a little bit of an increase there. And this is more or less where we arguably are at this point in time, with Georgia 06G still being the predominant runner market type that is on the scene today. However, so these are pretty much the major market types, and we don't have every single cultivar listed here. But since this time, we have seen a number of other cultivars that have an increased amount of seed sizes with respect to these other ones. Specifically, Florida 07 released in 2009, 77 grams per 100 kernels. And then in 2018, Tough Runner 297, 84 grams per 100 kernels. And when we kind of look at this the two ends of the spectrum, we end up seeing a doubling in size of kernels from Dixie Runner over to Tough Runner 297. But keeping pace with this, we really didn't see that many changes corresponding to the grading system that is being used to grade these for farmer stock peanut. And this isn't just a historical piece of information. We still see a range in seed sizes for runner cultivars that are grown today. And here's a list of several that are common, or at least have been in recent history. And we still are seeing a range of about 210 seed per pound when we compare something like a Georgia 13M, which was approximately the same size as what we saw for early runner, in comparison with larger cultivars such as Tough Runner 297. For Virginia market types, we still see a range in kernel size, albeit it is not as large as that which we see for the runners. Here, seeing about an 80 seed per pound range in kernel size. So this information indicates that naturally there is seed-side variation within different market types, but we really don't see much variation in the sheller screens that are used on the reciprocating shellers in the grading room for these different market types. And for pretty much all of this history that we're looking at, the runner market types have been graded on the standard runner sheller screen. And here I'm really only talking about the slot sizes corresponding to those coming from the red pan of the presizer. And those standard runner sheller screens utilize the 26 by 64 inch width for the slots. And for the Virginia market types, the standard screen utilizes a width of 34/64 of an inch there. And as of about 3 years ago or so, USDA updated its regulations to allow a larger sized sheller screen to be used for runners when there's large kernel sizes being looked at. And this includes both the Virginia screen as well as a larger runner screen that measures with a width of 28/64 of an inch. However, there really isn't a lot of current reports or guidelines that are based upon data that I've been able to find in order to guide this sheller screen selection. And so this was really the main motivation for this work, to see if we can examine the cultivars that we have and look at what might be a reasonable threshold to look at this. And so we combined our data here in the VC, and depending upon which combination of market type and sheller screen we were looking at, we had in between 24 and 133 data sets that were applicable for each of those combinations. Here we're going to look at the Virginia market type data first. And as we can see over here on the left with the regression, we have that nice horizontal line, real high p-value, a slope of about 0, really no significant relationship with sound splits for Virginia market types with increasing seed size. When we look at the runner data, we do see a different situation. When runners are processed on the standard runner sheller screen at 26 by 64 inch width slots, then we get a highly significant linear relationship. We get a slope of about 1.16, and that's on the Logit scale, and an overall agreement of close to 80% between the observations and the predictions from the model. When runner market types are shelled on the larger Virginia screen, larger holes, we are not seeing a significant relationship between those sound splits and those kernel sizes there. And again, p-value for that is pretty high, about 0.69. So from this, we can observe that we're getting a significant relationship for runners when they're shelled on the 26/64 inch screen in relation to larger kernel sizes. However, is this just an academic observation, or is there, what is the cost to the farmer? And so in order to get a better handle on this, we utilize this formula that we have down here in the bottom left. And this basically takes the data and applies the cumulative standard normal function in combination with the estimate that we have for our among study variance there to see what would be the likelihood of giving a given sound split increase for large seeded runners in comparison to our small seeded runner check here, the small seeded runner check corresponding to something the size of Georgia 13M. And the three different estimates that we have here, the three different lines, those each correspond to legitimate estimates for seed sizes for a cultivar such as Tough Runner 297. And so just kind of looking at this over here on the left, we have about a 50% probability of having an increase of anywhere from about 2% more sound splits for those larger runners, up to about 4.5% greater sound splits compared to that small seeded runner control. And this corresponds to $1 per 1,000 kilogram economic loss to the farmer of between about $2 and $4.5 there. And that's pretty close to dollars per ton. And so that's at the 50% probability level. And we can see that, with these curves over here on the right, we have a chance of having an increased amount of damage or sound splits compared to the small seeded runner, although the probability of that decreases as we get further out there. And just for reference here, we have the 25% probability levels here. And then at the low end of the spectrum, we're looking at about an increase of 5.5% more sound splits up to about 8% more sound splits. And then again, that corresponds to economic losses to the farmer stock load between $5 and $7 per 1,000 kilograms. And this might still seem like small amounts overall, but when we take into account the amount of yield that might be corresponding to these grading results, and if we're looking at a 3-ton, a 6,000 pound per acre yield, these end up being real numbers, having about a 50% probability of a $12 per acre loss up to a 25% probability of having a $19 per acre loss. And this could easily cover the cost of a good fungicide treatment or other crop management practices. So we can see from that data that as it stands, the 26/64 inch sheller screen is associated with significant and measurable losses when we're shelling larger seeded runners on those screens. And we have the data that shows that when the Virginia sheller screen is used, then we no longer see that relationship with sound splits, with kernel size. And while we didn't have the direct shelling data for the 28/64 inch screen, we did the next best thing and looked at available published results for kernel sizes in order to get a handle on what the widths of these different kernels would be in order to compare what the screen size tolerances would be for these different sheller screens. And utilizing the reference threshold advocated through the UPPT testing results, we have that 2/64 of an inch of a threshold of a larger size opening in the sheller screen compared to the largest size kernel that we would be shelling. And so we looked at the available data that we had here and compared the kernel dimensions in order to look at them as a function of the sound mature kernel weight. We also obtained an estimate for the density of these kernels, and then that did not significantly vary with kernel weight there. And then we assumed an approximately ellipsoid shape for the kernel in order to get at volume there. So what we saw from this data here was that we had highly significant linear relationships here with length as a function of sound mature kernel weight, and then with the aspect ratios for width and thickness as functions of length. And so each of these had robust R-squared values of over 80%, and so pretty reasonable fits there. And so we use this information to get an estimate of the width of these different kernels of different sized cultivars, and then compared that to the estimates that we obtained through the density volume based estimation. And it was kind of interesting how close the resulting numbers ended up being about 0.1 millimeters among each other. But anyway, so what we saw from here was that the widths varied from about 9.7 to 10.1 millimeters, which again provides more supporting evidence that the 26/64 inch sheller screen is too small to adequately shell those kernels because it doesn't allow for that 2/64 inch tolerance. And then our previous data showed that larger Virginia sheller screen provided an adequate clearance for those kernels, but this provides supporting evidence that 28/64 inch sheller screen provides a reasonably adequate clearance for these larger seeded runners. And at the very least, it's much better than the 26/64 inch sheller screen. So basically, looking at this, the recommendation that we have from this work is that after 65 years since the grading system has been brought onto the scene, probably many of us would agree that it's probably time to retool the grading process. And at the very least, if we want to have a quick fix to retrofit the current grading system, we can at least link the cultivar name with this farmer stock load for processing in the grading room. And if our reference kernel sizes and those weights of those kernels are at least 75 grams per 100 kernels or more, then this would be a good threshold to use a larger sheller screen, such as the Virginia sheller screen or the 28/64-inch runner sheller screen. Naturally, with logistics, we'd like to avoid any additional steps in the process, such as having a new pod or kernel sizing step, although we do have data to help with those recommendations if that was the desired path. But ultimately, my question is, and I can certainly be missing something, but ultimately, what really is the continued relevance of the silent split deduction? As it currently stands, it seems to represent a loss of value to the farmer, but not for the sheller or the market. And we have over here that whodunit in question mark. And from what it appears, it seems to really be a function not of something that the grower has under their control. Nevertheless, it is relevant for different things, I think, but specifically for seed production. But again, I would maybe suggest that instead of being applied to the farmer, it might in turn be turned around and used to discount the purchase price of affected seed that have excess amounts of silent splits. All right, so that concludes my talk. I'd like to thank everybody who helped with this work, as well as our support for this, South Carolina Peanut Board and Georgia Seed Development. And if there is any time, I'll be glad to take questions.
Thanks, Dan, for an excellent presentation and something certainly for us to think about as we move forward. I think we need to move on to our next presentation. I don't see a question in either of the boxes, so we'll move on to our next presentation. Again, thanks, Dan, for a great presentation.